What happens when a country music superstar gets cornered by hard-hitting questions on live television and decides he has had enough? Well, you are about to witness one of the most explosive television moments in recent memory as Blake Shelton faces off against George Stephanopoulos in an interview that went completely off the rails. This is not your typical morning show chat about new albums and tour dates. This is raw, unfiltered tension that builds to a shocking climax that left the entire Good Morning America studio in stunned silence. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below with your thoughts on celebrity interviews gone wrong. The morning started like any other at the Good Morning America studio in Times Square. Blake Shelton had arrived to promote his latest country album, looking relaxed in his signature jeans and cowboy boots combination. The interview was supposed to be a standard 15-minute segment, the kind of friendly promotional chat that morning television thrives on. George Stephanopoulos sat across from him, his notes prepared, cameras rolling, and millions of viewers tuning in, expecting the usual banter about music, The Voice, and life in Oklahoma. But from the very first question, something felt different in the air. George leaned forward slightly, his expression more serious than the typical morning show host demeanor. "Blake, thanks for joining us this morning. Your new album has been getting great reviews, but I want to start with something that has been making headlines recently. There have been some pretty strong criticisms about your comments regarding the music industry, and specifically your thoughts on newer artists. Some people are calling your remarks outdated and even harmful to up-and-coming musicians. How do you respond to that?" Blake shifted in his chair, his easygoing smile faltering just a bit. You could see the surprise flash across his face. This was not the softball question he had been expecting. "Well, George, I think that is a pretty loaded way to start this conversation. I have always been supportive of new artists. I have spent years on The Voice helping launch careers and mentor singers who are just starting out. But that is not really what I am asking about." George pressed his voice, taking on that familiar prosecutorial tone that had made him famous in political interviews. "I am talking specifically about your recent comments where you suggested that many new artists today lack authenticity and are more focused on social media presence than actual musical talent. Critics say that sounds like an older generation dismissing younger voices." The tension in the studio was palpable now. Blake sat back in his chair, his jaw tightening slightly. "George, I think you are taking my words out of context here. What I said was that the industry has changed, and sometimes I worry that the focus on viral moments and online content overshadows the craft of songwriting and live performance. That is not dismissing anyone. That is just an observation from someone who has been doing this for over 2 decades. George was not backing down. He flipped through his notes deliberately, creating a moment of uncomfortable silence. "But Blake, when you say things like, 'Some of these kids today would not last 5 minutes in a real honky-tonk,' how is that not dismissive? How is that not exactly the kind of gatekeeping that people are criticizing?" Blake's face was starting to ween, his country accent becoming more pronounced as his frustration grew. "Now hold on just a minute, George. You are cherry-picking quotes and twisting them into something they are not. I never said anything about kids not lasting in honky-tonks. What I said was that there is something to be said for artists who have paid their dues playing dive bars and small venues before they make it big. That is not gatekeeping. That is just valuing experience and hard work." "I have the transcript right here," George said, tapping his papers. "These are your exact words from the interview with Country Music Weekly. Would you like me to read more of what you said?" The country star's hands were now gripping the arms of his chair. "Go ahead, George. Read whatever you want, but I know what I said, and I know what I meant. And frankly, I am starting to wonder if this is really about promoting my album or if you brought me here to ambush me with some kind of gotcha journalism." George maintained his composure, but there was a spark in his eyes now. "Blake, this is not an ambush. This is journalism. When public figures make statements that generate controversy, it is our job to ask about them. Your comments have sparked a real debate in the music community about generational divides and industry gatekeeping. Do not you think your platform comes with responsibility?" "My platform?" Blake's voice was rising now, drawing concerned glances from crew members off camera. "My platform is built on 20-plus years of making music that people love. My platform is built on helping other artists succeed on The Voice. My platform is built on being honest about what I see happening in this business. If that makes some people uncomfortable, maybe that says more about them than it does about me." The interview was clearly going off script now. George glanced at his producer off camera, but pressed forward with the intensity of a courtroom cross-examination. But honest about what exactly, Blake? Honest about thinking that artists who build their careers through social media and streaming platforms are somehow less legitimate than those who came up through traditional channels, because that is how many people are interpreting your comments. Blake stood up abruptly, his chair rolling back slightly. The sudden movement sent a ripple of tension through the entire studio. You know what, George? I think I have heard enough. You invited me here under false pretenses. You told my people this was going to be about my music, about my tours, about the positive things I am doing. Instead, you are trying to paint me as some kind of bitter old-timer who hates young people. That is not who I am, and that is not what I said. George remained seated, his voice calm but firm. Blake, I understand this might be uncomfortable, but these are legitimate questions based on your own public statements. If you feel your words are being misinterpreted, this is your opportunity to clarify. Clarify. Blake's voice was now carrying across the entire studio. I should not have to clarify common sense when I talk about artists paying their dues. I am talking about the value of experience, of learning your craft, of understanding what it means to connect with an audience night after night in small venues where you cannot hide behind production and autotune. That is not controversial, George. That is just reality. The host leaned forward, sensing he had struck a nerve. But Blake, is not that exactly the kind of thinking that has kept the country music industry predominantly white and male for decades? When you talk about paying dues and honky-tons and dive bars, are not you really talking about a very specific cultural experience that excludes a lot of diverse voices? That question landed like a bombshell. Blake's face went from red to nearly purple, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Blake's entire demeanor changed in that instant. The question about diversity and exclusion in country music had clearly crossed a line he was not prepared for. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, the kind of tone that meant trouble was brewing. George, I am going to stop you right there. You just crossed from journalism into character assassination. And I will not sit here and let you paint me as some kind of racist. George did not flinch. If anything, he seemed energized by Blake's reaction. I never use that word, Blake, but you seem very defensive about a straightforward question regarding industry diversity. Is that not worth discussing? Do not play word games with me, Blake shot back, his finger now pointing directly at the host. You know exactly what you are implying. You are sitting there trying to twist my words about musical experience and hard work into some kind of racial dog whistle. That is not journalism, George. That is tabloid garbage. The studio had gone completely silent, except for the hum of cameras still rolling. Crew members were frozen in place, unsure whether to intervene or let this explosive moment play out. George shuffled his papers again, a gesture that was clearly getting under Blake's skin. Blake, I think you are overreacting here. I asked a legitimate question about whether traditional pathways in country music might inadvertently exclude diverse voices. Your response is telling. My response, Blake laughed, but there was no humor in it. My response is that I have spent my entire career judging people by their talent, not their skin color. I have worked with artists of every background on The Voice. I have supported and mentored singers who look nothing like me and come from completely different worlds. So, do not you dare sit there and lecture me about diversity while you ambush me on live television. George leaned back slightly, but his expression remained intense. Then help me understand, Blake. When you talk about honky-tons and dive bars as the proper way to pay dues, what does that look like in practice? Because statistically, those venues have historically been spaces that were not always welcoming to artists of color. Blake was pacing now, unable to remain still. His publicist off camera was making frantic gestures trying to get his attention, but he was locked in combat with the host. You know what, George? I think I know what this is really about. You brought me here to create a moment. You brought me here to get a soundbite that you can use to generate controversy and drive ratings. This is not about my music or my comments. This is about you trying to make a name for yourself by taking down someone in country music. That is absolutely not true, George replied firmly. This interview is about accountability. When public figures make statements that resonate in problematic ways, it is our responsibility to explore those implications. Problematic. Blake's voice cracked with indignation. The only thing problematic here is your agenda-driven journalism. I came here to talk about my album, to share my music with people who might enjoy it. Instead, you have turned this into some kind of political inquisition where you are trying to make me the poster boy for everything you think is wrong with country music." George straightened his tie, a small gesture, but one that seemed calculated to irritate. "Blake, if you feel that asking about diversity and inclusion in your industry is a political inquisition, maybe that says something about the industry itself." That comment hit like a slap. Blake stopped pacing and turned to face George directly, his eyes blazing. "Are you kidding me right now? You're going to lecture me about inclusion. I have been a coach on The Voice for over a decade, working with artists from every genre, every background, every walk of life. I have used my platform to lift up voices that might never have been heard otherwise. But because I dare to suggest that experience and hard work matter in this business, you want to paint me as some kind of villain." "I am not painting you as anything," George responded coolly. "I am asking you to examine the implications of your own words. When you suggest that certain pathways are more legitimate than others, you are inherently creating hierarchies. And those hierarchies have historically excluded certain groups." Blake slammed his hand down on the arm of his chair, the sound echoing through the studio. "That is complete nonsense, and you know it. Valuing experience is not creating hierarchies. Respecting the process of learning your craft is not exclusion. What you are doing right now is taking reasonable observations about the music business and twisting them into something sinister." George glanced at his notes again, clearly preparing for another pointed question. "Let me ask you this directly, Blake. Do you believe that an artist who builds their career primarily through social media and streaming platforms has earned the same level of respect as someone who spent years playing small venues?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Blake stared at George for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with barely controlled anger. "You want a direct answer? Fine. I believe that all paths to success require different kinds of work and dedication. But I also believe that there is something invaluable about performing live night after night in front of audiences who will let you know immediately if you are not connecting. That is not about age or race or any other demographic. That is about the craft of performance." But Blake George Pre, when you frame it that way, are not you essentially saying that artists who have not had access to those traditional venues, perhaps because of geographic location, economic circumstances, or yes, discrimination, are somehow less worthy? Blake's face went through a range of emotions from anger to confusion to something that looked almost like panic. "That is not what I am saying at all. And the fact that you keep twisting my words proves that this entire interview is in bad faith." George sensed he had found another pressure point. "I am not twisting anything, Blake. I am following your logic to its natural conclusion. If traditional pathways are superior, then artists who could not access those pathways are at a disadvantage. Not because of their talent, but because of circumstances beyond their control." "You are putting words in my mouth." Blake exploded, his voice now carrying throughout the entire studio complex. "I never said traditional pathways were superior. I said they were valuable. I said they taught important lessons. There is a huge difference between valuing something and declaring it the only legitimate path." George remained maddeningly calm in the face of Blake's growing fury. "Then perhaps you can understand why your comments have been interpreted as gatekeeping. When someone with your influence suggests that certain experiences are more valuable than others, it sends a message about who belongs and who does not." Blake was breathing heavily now, his hands shaking slightly with adrenaline. "The only message I am trying to send is that music is a craft that requires dedication and hard work, regardless of how you choose to pursue it, but apparently in your world, even that basic concept is somehow controversial." The host looked directly into the camera, then back at Blake. "I think what is controversial is the unwillingness to acknowledge how industry standards and expectations can inadvertently perpetuate exclusion." That was the final straw. Blake took a step toward George's desk, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "You know what, George? I am done with this charade. You did not bring me here for an interview. You brought me here for an execution. And I am not going to stand here and let you destroy my reputation with your twisted logic and loaded questions." George finally showed a crack in his composure, leaning back slightly as Blake approached. "Blake, I think you are letting your emotions get the better of you here." "My emotions?" Blake's laugh was bitter and sharp. "My emotions are the only honest thing left in this conversation because everything else has been a setup from the very beginning." The studio atmosphere had reached a breaking point. Blake was now standing directly in front of George's desk, towering over the seated host with barely contained rage. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of what was becoming television history. George, to his credit, maintained eye contact despite the obvious intimidation factor. "Blake, I need you to step back and return to your seat," George said, his voice steady, but with an edge of concern. "We can continue this conversation professionally." Professionally, Blake's voice was now a roar that could be heard throughout the entire studio complex. "You call this ambush professional. You call twisting my words into something racist professional. There is nothing professional about what you have done here today, George." George stood up slowly, not backing down, but clearly trying to diffuse the physical tension. "I have asked you legitimate questions based on your own public statements. If you feel uncomfortable answering them, that is your choice. But do not blame me for doing my job." "Your job." Blake was gesturing wildly now, his hands cutting through the air as he spoke. "Your job is supposed to be informing the public, not creating controversy where none exists. Your job is supposed to be fair and balanced reporting, not gotcha journalism designed to destroy people's reputations." The host maintained his composure, but there was steel in his voice. "Now, Blake, no one is trying to destroy your reputation. But when you make public statements, especially ones that touch on sensitive issues like diversity and inclusion, those statements are going to be scrutinized. That is how democracy works." "Democracy?" Blake laughed bitterly, shaking his head in disbelief. "This is not democracy, George. This is a kangaroo court where you get to be judge, jury, and executioner. You decided before I even sat down that I was guilty of something, and you have spent this entire interview trying to prove it." George picked up his notes, flipping through them deliberately. "I have quotations directly from your interviews, Blake. These are not interpretations. These are your words, and I have explained the context of those words multiple times." Blake shot back, his voice from shouting. "But you do not want context. You want a villain. You want someone to blame for whatever problems you think exist in country music." The tension was so thick it was almost suffocating. Crew members were looking at each other nervously, unsure whether to intervene. Blake's publicist was frantically trying to get his attention, making cutting gestures across her throat, but he was too far gone to notice. George set his papers down with deliberate precision. "Blake, let me ask you one final question. Do you think your comments might have unintentionally discouraged young artists, particularly those from underrepresented communities, from pursuing careers in country music?" Blake stared at George for a long moment, his chest heaving. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but filled with venom. "You know what I think, George? I think you are a small man trying to make a big name for yourself by tearing down people who have actually accomplished something in their lives. I think you are using your platform to divide people instead of bringing them together, and I think this interview is over." "Blake, we still have several minutes left in the segment," George said, glancing at the clock. "Would not you rather use this time to clarify your position?" "Clarify my position?" Blake's voice was rising again. "My position is crystal clear. I believe in hard work. I believe in dedication. I believe in treating people with respect regardless of where they come from or what they look like. But apparently those values are not good enough for your narrative." George leaned forward slightly, sensing that Blake was at his breaking point. "Then why not take this opportunity to say that directly to the audience? Why not use your platform to send a positive message about inclusion in country music?" Blake's eyes flashed with rage. "Because I refuse to play your game, George. I refuse to let you bully me into making some kind of forced apology for comments that were never problematic in the first place. I refuse to let you turn me into a symbol of everything you think is wrong with my industry." The host's voice took on a challenging tone. "So, you are saying you have no regrets about your comments? No concerns about how they might have been received?" "My only regret," Blake said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "is agreeing to come on this show in the first place. My only regret is thinking that Good Morning America was still a place where artists could come to share their work without being subjected to character assassination." George straightened his tie again, the gesture that had been irritating Blake throughout the interview. "Blake, I think you are being overly dramatic here. These are important conversations that need to happen." That comment was the final trigger. Blake's control snapped completely. "Overly dramatic? You want to see dramatic, George?" He reached up and unclipped his wireless microphone, the small device making a sharp popping sound as it disconnected. "I am done with this circus. I am done with your loaded questions. I am done with your agenda-driven journalism. And I am especially done with you." George's composure finally cracked slightly, his eyebrows raising in surprise. "Blake, You cannot just walk away from an interview. We are live on national television. Blake threw his microphone down on George's desk with enough force to make the host flinch. Watch me walk away, George. Watch me refuse to participate in your little witch hunt any longer. He turned toward the camera, addressing the viewers directly. Folks at home, I apologize that you had to witness this. I came here to talk about music, but apparently that was not what this show had in mind. George stood up quickly, trying to regain control of the situation. Blake, please let us finish this conversation like professionals. Blake spun around, pointing directly at George with barely controlled fury. Professional? You want to talk about professional? A professional would have asked me about my album. A professional would have asked me about my tour dates. A professional would have asked me about my work on The Voice, but instead you chose to ambush me with political questions, designed to make me look bad. That is not professional, George. That is pathetic. The studio had gone completely silent, except for the hum of equipment and the distant sound of traffic from Times Square below. Blake was now walking toward the exit, his boots echoing on the studio floor with each determined step. George called after him, his voice carrying a note of desperation. Blake, if you leave now, you are only proving my point about accountability in the entertainment industry. Blake stopped dead in his tracks, slowly turning around to face George one last time. His voice was quiet, but filled with contempt. The only thing I am proving, George, is that some of us still have enough self-respect to walk away when we are being mistreated. Some of us still believe that integrity matters more than ratings. George made one last attempt to salvage the interview. Blake, your fans deserve to hear your side of this story. Do not you think you owe them that? Blake's laugh was cold and bitter. My fans know who I am, George. They know my heart. They know my character. They do not need you to interpret my words for them or tell them what to think about me. Unlike some people, I trust my audience to make their own decisions. With that, Blake Shelton turned and walked straight toward the studio exit, leaving George Stephanopoulos sitting alone at his desk with several minutes of dead airtime remaining. The cameras continued rolling as George tried to compose himself, shuffling his papers nervously while the crew looked on in stunned silence. As Blake reached the studio door, he paused for just a moment, looking back over his shoulder. Luck with your ratings, George. I hope this was worth it. Then he pushed through the door and was gone, leaving behind one of the most explosive television moments in Good Morning America history. George turned to the camera, attempting to regain his professional composure despite the chaos that had just unfolded. We will be right back after this commercial break, he said, his voice slightly shaky. But everyone watching knew that nothing would be quite the same after what they had just witnessed. The interview that was supposed to promote Blake's new album had instead become a masterclass in how quickly things can spiral out of control. When two strong personalities clash on live television, it was a moment that would be talked about, analyzed, and replayed for years to come. What did you think about this explosive confrontation? Was George Stephanopoulos justified in his tough questioning, or did he cross the line into ambush journalism? And how do you think Blake Shelton could have handled the situation differently?